Well, I was very excited when I got the opportunity to talk to an audience consisting of highly educated people who are interested in education and interested in the topic of intelligence, a topic that I've always been interested in, although only started to formally study about 5 years ago. I was trained as a social psychologist, and I mostly functioned as a cognitive psychologist, and primarily I've been interested in reasoning, how people do it, the kinds of errors that people make in reasoning, and the possible ways in which reasoning could be improved. I've also looked at cultural differences in reasoning, and I've found that there are astonishingly large differences in the way that East Asians and Westerners reason. So in light of this work, I was puzzled about the field of intelligence, which I'd sort of kept up with my left hand, since it was so clear to me that I could change people's cognitive apparatus in a matter of minutes with respect to some important inferential rules. And social psychologists can change your motivation to perform on some task by, sometimes just by the way they move their hand. I mean, we can have lots of important impacts on people through what seem like trivial kinds of manipulations. I became convinced that the very foundations of the field of intelligence are mistaken. Those foundations were laid down by Charles Spearman about 100 years ago. He was a brilliant man. The outlines that he laid down are extremely plausible, so plausible that they've dominated the field until now, essentially, and have not largely changed. They were captured in a book in 1994 called The Bell Curve, which sold 300,000 copies and became the basis for what most of you know about intelligence. And what I'm about to describe is not only the foundations of the field of intelligence, but also the outline of that book. And those foundations, I'm going to argue, are all misconceptions. First of all, intelligence is one thing. It's essentially your IQ score that captures it, or G for general intelligence, which is the IQ score that's based on how well correlated each subtest is with a full test. It's not terribly different from IQ score, but a little bit more predictive. Fluid intelligence, fluid G, is the core of intelligence. That's what does the work that makes us smarter or less smart than other people. Fluid G is concerned with executive functions. It's concerned with your ability to control your attention properly in solving a problem. It deals with working memory, that is your ability to have things in mind, in virtual memory, which you can bring down to solve the particular problem that you're working on. It's behind what we do to solve novel and especially abstract problems. And that's it. That's IQ. That's intelligence. The heritability of IQ is very high, in the range of 0.6 to 0.8. Heritability, by the way, many people assume that something like the figure 0.8 is the percent of your intelligence which is inherited. That's quite mistaken. Heritability is a population value. It refers to the percent of variance in a population which is due to genes. Very different from the percent of your smarts, which have to do with genes. Environmental differences contribute little to IQ. IQ just basically unfolds in anything like a reasonably normal environment. Family environment's not very important. School makes little difference to intelligence. Early childhood education as a means of remediating kids who might be behind in intellectual development doesn't work. There's been substantial dysgenesis in intelligence. That's because the smartest people, higher social class people, are having fewer children than lower social class people, and as a result, we're slowly getting less intelligent. The difference in IQ between the social classes is growing, and that's because people meet each other, and like you, highly educated, enclaves where you meet people like yourself who just keep increasing the intelligence of your social class. And other people are in enclaves which are not so favored, and so the gap grows between the social classes. Blacks' IQ has been 15 points lower than whites for the past 80 years. The main reason for that is genetics. Asians have higher IQs than whites. The main reason for that is genetics. And there's a policy implication of enormous importance of everything I just said, which is that we really should save time and money. Don't attempt to raise intelligence, especially of lower social class people and of minorities. And that was quite clearly the message of the bell curve. All right, first the topic of heritability. It's not close to 0.8. Family environment effects and environment effects that are associated with particular families are very important. Errors have been made by IQ experts. They're easy errors to have made. One kind of basis for the assumption that the heritability is so great is that the IQ of identical twins is so similar even if they're raised in different environments. And the assumption is, well, look, they were raised in different environments and yet they're extremely similar to the extent of 0.8, correlation of 0.8, and that indicates that the contribution of genetics must be very great. But identical twins are typically not, they are not dropped by helicopter on different parts of the country. They're raised typically in the same town, often by relatives. They go to the same school. And when you really do the experiment here of looking at identical twins who are raised in quite different environments, the correlations go way down to the vicinity of 0.4 to 0.5. A second totally reasonable way of concluding that genetics is enormously important is that the IQ of adopted children is a better predictor of that kid's IQ than the adoptive parent's IQ. So it looks like it's the genes that are driving the bus here because that's where you get the predictability of the adopted kid's IQ. The adopted parent's IQ is much less important. Perfectly true, but adoptive families are like Tolstoy's happy families. They're all alike. That is, they're highly favorable environments, and they don't differ much from each other. In fact, if you look at the variation on any kind of dimension which you would think would impact intellectual ability, that variation is shrunk enormously and pushed toward the high end for adoptive families. And there are two things that I hope you take away from this, if nothing else. This next point. The effect of adoption is between 12 and 18 points on IQ. That's absolutely huge. It's been well documented in studies with any number of different designs, and that's simply an end to the question of whether the environment is important. Typically, you have adoption by middle class or upper middle class families of children who are typically lower SES kids. The environment has a massive effect, and a 15-point IQ difference, which is the standard deviation, which will be familiar metric to many of you, that's the difference, for example, between someone with an IQ of 100 who would be expected to have a year or two of community college and who might be a manager of a store or who might be an insurance salesperson and so on, versus someone with an IQ of 115 who would be expected, as a matter of course, to go to college and would be a candidate for graduate or professional school. It's very important to know that there's no such thing as the value for heritability. It's highly dependent on social class. The heritability of IQ for upper middle class people is in fact around the range of 0.7 to 0.8. That's because of this narrow range of environments that I was talking about for this group of people. If environments differ very little, the only thing that's going to matter is genes. At the limit, identical environments, differences can only be explained by genes. But for lower SES people, heritability is virtually nil. And that's because the environments range enormously from as good as you would ever find for an upper middle class family to chaotic and disruptive in every respect. Now that figure is so important because it implies wide latitude of our ability to affect intelligence of lower SES kids. And finally, and this is the second thing, if you go to sleep now, that's okay, just remember this point. Even very high heritability has no implications for modifiability. Let me say that again more emphatically. even very high heritability has no implications for modifiability. Well, let's look for just a minute at what some of the subtests of IQ tests are. And they're grouped into crystallized versus fluid type of intelligence. Crystallized means it's stuff you've learned that's stored away. You can bring it to bear on a problem that seems to match the features of the rule that you're looking for. So there's information, vocabulary, comprehension, and that's not paragraph comprehension like on SAT. It's comprehension of the way the world works. So why do doctors go back and get more education? Similarities is the ability to recognize how two things are similar, either because they occupy the same taxonomic category or because of some higher level principle, which is more interesting, like why are vengeance and forgiveness alike? And they include routines, procedures like arithmetic that are stored, ready to apply it when they're necessary to a particular problem. Fluid intelligence, this is where your mind has to operate in some way, not simply bringing some information that's stored or trying to rummage around in your knowledge base, but requires you to hold. Working memory is critical to most of these. That is, the ability to hold several things in mind at the same time in such a way that they can be brought down and address the particular part of the problem that you're working on at the moment. Now, fluid intelligence is not the core or the center of intelligence. Fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence are literally separate components of analytic intelligence. They are completely different kinds of things. And this is shown by several different facts. First of all, fluid intelligence declines with age. You see? Crystallized intelligence increases up until very old age. Is there anyone here who's under the age of 21? I'm sorry, you're all over the hill with respect to. By the time you're my age, you will have lost 15 IQ points worth of fluid IQ. But I don't miss it. And I'm only partly kidding, because it's true. I can't. You give me a new remote, I have to find the nearest child to be able to help me operate it. I find new statistical procedures difficult, but for kinds of material that I have crystallized material to work on, I'm okay. Now, why might it be that these things would have such different developmental trajectories? The prefrontal cortex is activated by fluid intelligence tests and not by crystallized intelligence tests. So they're mediated by different parts of the brain. And it's not surprising that fluid intelligence declines as people get older, because the prefrontal cortex deteriorates particularly badly with age. Lesions to the prefrontal cortex can be so severe that a person with average crystallized intelligence can have fluid intelligence in the range of retardation, IQ 70. If you knew such a person with such severe lesions, you probably wouldn't know it. You would probably never discover that person, unless you happen to say, here's a new statistical technique, go and learn it. And you can go the other way as well. You can find low crystallized intelligence, as you can find in autism, but normal or even superior fluid intelligence. And very important, I think, for topics we'll discuss later, is that stress profoundly affects prefrontal cortex and PFC functioning. And lower SES people and minorities have much more of it, making learning much more difficult. And finally, there are computer exercises which can train fluid intelligence. That's what we're just now finding out. A few hours a day for a few weeks will increase working memory to the extent that almost all fluid intelligence tasks can be substantially improved. But it won't touch crystallized intelligence, which is a different thing. Well, are we getting less intelligent? No. James Flynn has shown the very opposite. There's been an 18-point gain in IQ from 1947 to 2002. Much more for fluid subtests, which the IQ fundamentalists will tell you, fluid IQ, that's just the absolute center of intelligence. That's a biological thing. It's largely inherited. There's not much you can do about it, except increase it by 20 IQ points in a couple of generations. Well, what does this mean for our understanding of what IQ is? And to me, it raises tremendous puzzles because it really isn't possible that we've gained more than a standard deviation in intelligence in 55 years, by now 65. Now, I don't know what actual intelligence is. I must say the more I study it, the further it seems to recede from me. But on the other hand, the gains on IQ tests are clearly representative of genuine intelligence gains. There's been a standard deviation increase in vocabulary during this period of time, and if you've got more words, you're smarter. The more words, the more concepts. Comprehension of the world has also improved markedly in children and in adults. So these are real gains. Now you're going to want to know what caused them, and many, many articles have been written. Let's just say, in the first instance, the Industrial Revolution and the Information Revolution have required certain kinds of changes in what you need to know, and somehow the culture has risen to meet that challenge, and so we're getting smarter. And a part of those cultures is surely the schools, because we know that the schools are doing things that will actually improve performance on IQ tests. Well, speaking of schools, are schools really largely irrelevant to intelligence, as some people have maintained? No, the school contribution to IQ is massive. If you look at a kid who can start first grade because he's of the right age, and look at another kid who's a day younger than that kid and so can't start school, a year from now, the one who's had school has 2 years of middle age over the kid who hasn't had school. 1 year of middle age above the kid. 2 years middle age greater, 1 year greater than the kid who didn't go to school. So, what can be done to make school better? First, a few things that don't seem to matter. Giving people a voucher that take it to a religious school or a private school or wherever they want. There's no evidence that that results in better education. Most charter schools, which are very popular, including with the current administration, are not very effective, with some extremely important exceptions, which I'll mention later. Teachers with higher degrees are not better than teachers with less good. But the individual teacher matters hugely, especially in kindergarten and in first grade. If you look at a kid who's had a kindergarten teacher who's had 10 years of experience and compare that with a kid whose kindergarten teacher has had 1 year experience, that's worth $1,000 per year on that kid's income, times 30 years of a career, times 20 kids in the class that kid was in, times 30 years of the teacher's career. So it's absolute, for the economy, for the society in general, it's an absolutely huge difference that's being made. The first grade teacher is so important that the following study showed that if you look at kids who are expected to do poorly in school because their parents both have very little education, and this kid is then put into a first grade class with a teacher who's in the bottom third of instructional effectiveness, that kid, in fact, is going to have trouble all the way through school. If you put that kid in a classroom with a teacher in the top third of instructional effectiveness, that kid's going to function essentially like a middle class kid. Class size is important. I won't go into the details. It's expensive to decrease class size. It has effects. I don't know how to think about the cost benefit of it. Some kinds of computerized instruction seem to be clearly effective. I mean, that many of these programs are in test right now. I'm persuaded that some of them really are quite effective. There's one project that's had amazing results, done a generation ago. Minister of Education of Venezuela asked Harvard University and Bolt Baranek Newman Research Institute to make their 7th graders smarter. So they then created an absolutely fantastic curriculum. It really is stuff that would make you smarter as opposed to learning what's the capital of Austria. I mean, teaching kids how to classify and categorize things, how to test hypotheses, the logic of the 2-by-2 table, analyzing analogies, about 30 or 40 different targeted skills. It increased performance on all of those, some of them very markedly. And at the end of the year, these kids had IQs that were 6.5 points higher than other kids. Now, there are two amazing things about this. The first thing that's amazing is that the first author on this was Richard Herrnstein, who was one of the authors on the bell curve. And I cannot explain that. I also can't explain the fact that the study remained unreplicated for 35 years until it was just replicated a couple of years ago, and it does replicate. These effects are genuine. Okay, how about the differences between social classes? Actually, they're steady or shrinking slightly. Genes are always going to be different between the social classes, at least a bit, because there are two ways to get higher social class. One is by better genes, and the other is by better environment. But genes may contribute very little to the difference between the social classes. The difference between the top third and the bottom third of social class in IQ is only 10 points, and there are a number of biological causes for which we know have an impact on IQ that differ between the classes. Fetal alcohol syndrome, exposure to lead, insecticide, healthcare, asthma, et cetera, et cetera. Breastfeeding, so far as we can tell at this point, is worth 6 points on IQ. It's absolutely a massive effect, so far as we can tell. And lower SES people are less likely to breastfeed than higher SES people. There are environmental causes which have biological effects, undoubtedly. Stress, which I've talked about earlier, and the prefrontal cortex effects on fluid IQ functioning. There are inner city schools where the average turnover from the beginning of the year to the end of the year is 100%. And imagine the disruption that caused a different kid in this class. And I've just been dropped into a class I'm totally behind. I don't know what they're doing. There's a drop overall in IQ and intellectual skills over the summer, but that's extremely conditioned on social class. There's a very significant drop in intellectual skills over the summer for the bottom fifth, less for the middle, and kids in the top social class stratum, the top 20%, actually gain over the summer. And almost surely that's because of huge environmental differences, the kind of intellectual stimulation that the upper middle class kid is still getting over the summer, and that's largely missing for the kids at the bottom. We're finding that there are huge differences in parental socialization across social classes. A middle-class kid, by the age of 3, has heard 30 million words. A working-class kid, by that age, has heard 20 million words. And that's only the half of it, because what's going on between middle-class parent and child is actual conversations. The kid says something, the parent says something in response to that, as opposed to just simple commands, do this, don't do that, or relatively minor kinds of intellectual interventions. Preparation for schooling is just enormously different. I mean, my kids, as soon as I could prop them up on a pillow, I was reading them books. I mean, you sort of know that if you're middle class, that you're supposed to do that. And around the dinner table, kids are taught how to evaluate, how to analyze, very different preparation for schooling. The middle class kid by the age of 3 has heard 6 encouragements. That's swell, John. That's really a good job. Per reprimand. Don't do that. The working class kid has heard 2 encouragements per reprimand. How about the black-white differences in IQ? First of all, if you actually are interested in this topic, which I find quite boring, you can look at the appendix to my book where I dealt with every evidence that I've been able to find one way or the other. All of the genetic claims with any indicating a difference between the races are based on very indirect tests. But we have direct tests of heritability in the form of a natural experiment, because in the US black population, about 20% of the genes are European. So we can now compare blacks who are virtually 100% African genes versus those who are largely white genes and see if that makes a difference. And this has been looked at in many different ways. Black kids in Chicago, geniuses, IQs over 140. Do they have more white ancestry? The answer is no, they don't. Not than kids with pure African ancestry. Blood group studies, which can diagnose fairly well how African versus European someone is, show no correlation between African versus European blood groups and IQ. And here's a study that is sufficient by itself to show the whole point here. Study where black and mixed race kids with one white and one black parent are adopted by either black or white families. The black and the mixed race kids have no difference in their IQs, whether they're raised by black families or raised by white families. But if they're raised by white families, the IQ is 13 points higher than if they're raised by black families. So genes, 0, environment, everything, and that difference. So why is the difference still 15 points? It isn't. It's down to 9.5, and National Assessment of Educational Progress shows comparable kinds of gains in intellectual skills. Well, what will impede further black-white gap reduction? Structural factors, which you all know about. Most of us live in worlds of affirmative action. Most blacks don't. The prejudice against young black males in employment is absolutely huge, remains that way. Not so much toward any other group, blacks, but young black males, and with the, and we can imagine that has a dampening effect on working in school when there's that pessimistic prospect. Environmental factors that we talked about before are worse for blacks. There are anti-achievement black subcultures in integrated schools and in inner city schools, which are all black. You know, don't act white is a factor. Stereotype threat, that is the society, I know what the society thinks of my group. They think we're not very smart. If I work very hard in school, I might show that that's true of me because I worked hard and I still didn't do well. But if I don't work hard, you can't prove that I'm not smart. And that's so, the stereotype can be a goad towards self-handicapping. And finally, the parental socialization differences of the kind I talked about as differing between the middle class and working class are amplified by race. Well, can we reduce the social class and black-white gaps in intelligence and academic achievement? Well, let's look at early childhood education. I'm not a fan of Head Start. It does produce modest increases in IQ, which tend to fade by early elementary school. The long-term effects are probably slight. We don't really know, because despite the fact that billions and billions of dollars have been spent on Head Start, we don't really know what the lifetime effects are. It's been around for 40 years. We don't know what the effects are. There are, however, some highly effective preschool programs with big initial IQ gains, which sometimes are retained to some degree even at adolescence, even without any further educational intervention, unusual intervention. But we now know that the effects of these programs are absolutely massive on achievement. It results in a 50% reduction in the likelihood of being put back in school, a 50% reduction in the likelihood of being put into a special education class, a 33% increase in the likelihood that the kid will graduate from high school, a 33% increase in the likelihood they will go to college. Economists estimate the payback on those programs to be between $4 and $8 per dollar spent. There's even a payback to the Treasury over the long haul for those dollars. So what if you continued the intervention into school? I mentioned before that there are some charter schools which we know to be highly effective. KIP for Knowledge is Power program. Uncommon Schools is another, and Achievement First, which are very similar. They're done with poor Black and Hispanic kids. For some reason, these programs tend to, most of them start in the 5th grade. I don't know why they wait that long, but they do. The kids spend 60% more time in school. They come at 7:30, they leave at 5:30, and it's not just drill and kill, as they say in educational circles. There's sports, music, museums, theater, upper middle class experiences that these kids get. Over a period from 5th to 7th grade, there's a half standard deviation equal, roughly in IQ terms, 7.5 points in math, and a third of a standard deviation in reading. How about Asian intelligence? Are we really going to doom to fall behind because of our European genes? There's much less evidence on this topic than there is on the genetic underpinnings of black-white differences, but there are a couple of highly relevant studies. One looked at first grade kids in the US, Japan, and Taiwan, compared their IQ. Now, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to compare IQ across cultures. Nevertheless, it was done in a fairly plausible way to me. The American kids were had slightly higher IQs than the Asian kids, but those differences were gone by 5th grade, and the Taiwanese kids were a standard deviation ahead of the American kids in math, and the Japanese kids were 1.3 standard deviations ahead of the Americans in math. So a very superior education system, at least with respect to math. Another very important study was done with graduating seniors in high school in 1966. Those kids had slightly lower IQs than the European American kids, probably because English was probably not spoken in the home. Despite that fact, they had SAT scores which were a third of a standard deviation higher. That's 70 points on a 1,400 point scale. It's enough to make a difference between what kind of college you get into. But the occupational attainment differences were massive. The Chinese American kids in that group were 62% more likely to be in professional, managerial, or technical occupations than the European American kids. Absolutely huge payoff on whatever native talent there was there. Why should there be these differences? Well, there are big cultural factors. Confucianism is very different from the Western kind of environment that our kids grow up in, our European kids. Confucianism allows families, which are much tighter, to have much greater demands on their kids. They demand it, and because of the culture that's there, it has an impact. There's always been an assumption that the way you get smart is through working harder. And Confucius had the idea that a part of intelligence is what he called a gift from heaven, but mostly it's working hard. For the last 2,000 years, the poorest kid in the village in China could become the highest magistrate in the land just by working harder at education. Okay, finally, how about Jewish intellectual prominence? The stereotype of Jews as being highly intelligent goes back as far as Mark Twain, who described Jews as being conspicuously the intellectual elite. I didn't realize it was that. It went back into the 19th century. But of course, the 20th century, it's been a history of amazing achievements in every kind of endeavor where intelligence matters. And of course, there's a substantial cultural emphasis on intellect and achievement. I don't know if any of you saw a recent New Yorker which said that some Jewish mothers in New York have a name for tiger mother, amateur. So could it be genetics? There are many armchair theories about it. The daughter of the rich merchant marries the son of the rabbi, and so on. They're easy to spin out, but there is a more recent theory which has a little more teeth in it than the armchair theories. Sphingolipids are essential for nerve transmission, but if you have too much sphingolipids, it's fatal. There are a number of diseases which are unique, I believe, or certainly relatively unique to Jews, which involve too much sphingolipids and Tay-Sachs, etc. The theory here is that they draw an analogy to the sickle cell problem, where if you have 2 copies of a particular gene, you're going to have sickle cell anemia. If you have no copies of that gene, you're going to be highly susceptible to malaria. If you have 1 copy of it, you have no sickle cell and protection against malaria. And so the assumption is if you have 1 copy of those genes, of that gene, you're smarter because you got better sphingolipids, and that's easily testable. Jews with 1 copy of that gene should be smarter than Jews with no copies of that gene. But before we get too convinced that there has to be a genetic difference, the differences between Jews and non-Jews in intellectual accomplishment, large as they are less than several other kinds of cultural differences that you can point to. Arab superiority to Europe in the period 7th century to 12th century, and European superiority to Arab in 15th century and beyond. Italian superiority to English culture up until the 14th century, and English superiority after the 18th century. And in the U.S. today, a huge difference in intellectual achievement between the South of the United States and New England. So we wouldn't want to jump too quickly to the conclusion that genetics plays a role. Well, there's a policy implication of everything that I've been saying, which is that you can influence intelligence, you can affect the intelligence of minorities and of lower SES people in general. What are some of the things we might do? The U.S. has become one of the most economically unequal countries in the world. We think of U.S. as being the land of opportunity. There's much less upward social mobility in the U.S. than there is in most European countries, and there's every reason to assume that that kind of inequality is going to be associated with lower outcomes for everything, including intellectual attainment. We could give the best available birth to preschool education for the neediest 1/6 of the population. That would be expensive, $40 or $50 billion a year. We could give the best available kindergarten through 9th grade for the neediest 1/6, and that would cost also expensive, about $20 billion a year. But we can put that in perspective that the tax cuts for the richest 2% in this country cost $70 billion a year. Now, of course, there are many calls for that $70 billion a year if we're going to get it, including deficit reduction. But it's not impossible to have massive effects on the poorest people in the country and on minorities if we choose to do that. But there's a big qualification to all this. We don't know if these programs will do what they call scaling up. The pilot program works. You get highly talented, highly dedicated people, has big impacts. Can you parlay that into wide societal impacts can you find the people who are talented enough and motivated enough to do it? Can you encourage the full population that could be served by it to involve? We don't know the answers to any of those questions, but I hope I persuaded you that it's worth finding out. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Richard, for this remarkable and provocative talk. I'd now like to invite you, as well as Bruce McEwen, to join me at the table. Bruce is Rockefeller's Alfred E. Mirsky Professor, and he's made key discoveries about hormones and brain development and he has a special interest in the long-term outcomes of stress and low socioeconomic status in childhood. So if you'll join me. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll start with a conversation here at the table, then we'll open up to questions from the audience. And I thought I'd first ask Bruce a few questions, and then I'd like to touch on a few points that were raised by Richard. So Bruce, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your studies on the effects of stress, which Richard alluded to, and the outcomes, the neurophysiological outcomes of stress in animal models, and how we can extrapolate those findings to understand the stress that's associated with low socioeconomic status.
Okay, good question. Well, first, just to say something about socioeconomic status, studies on socioeconomic status and health, income and education, meaning SAS, have shown in the US and in Europe, they are linear gradients from across income and education. So it's not just the poor people who are the most adversely affected, it's the middle class rising up to the upper class. And another major contributor in terms of stress are early adverse childhood experiences, which range from chaos in the home and abuse and neglect. But the CDC did a study in the Kaiser Permanente health system in California, a middle-class population, and documented a lot of this. So it's a widespread problem, but probably sorts out across a gradient from the lowest to the highest SES. So keeping in mind that when we think of this as a problem, it's not just a problem of the poorest, it's a problem that distributes across society. So now our research is on animal models. We're interested in how stress impacts and stress hormones impact the brain. We know that there are at least 3 brain regions that are responsive to stress. The hippocampus is an organ of memory and also mood regulation, and it tends to be impaired by chronic stress. The amygdala is an organ of anxiety and aggression, and it tends to be increased in activity by chronic stress. And so you get an imbalance, an anxious individual that may be very adaptive in a dangerous environment. And then there's the prefrontal cortex that we heard a lot about, which really has to do with not only working memory, but the development of self-regulatory behaviors, including impulse regulation. And chronic stress will cause that brain region to become less effective. And so when you look at these things, and these things are then also affected developmentally by early life experiences, the way the person's brain reflects this circuitry that may reflect less ability to regulate their behavior, more impulsivity, more anxiety, more or less ability to learn and remember things. And then just sort of a final comment, physical activity and also the growing epidemic of diabetes and obesity and diabetes. Diabetes has a huge impact on brain development and function, and is something that we talked about earlier, is something that factors into a child's ability to acquire information and function competitively in society. So that's just a little bit of the sort of thing.
So you both talked about the downsides of stress. What about, we think about the paradox of high-achieving environment where the children are pushed to achieve. Is that stress beneficial or detrimental? Can there be
actually,
a tip?
an example, regular physical activity will increase the size of the hippocampus and the function of the prefrontal cortex, making decision-making better and so forth. There's a study of German medical students showing, following the volume of their hippocampus in an intensive learning experience, showing that it increases during that intensive learning experience, and even after they've taken their exam, it continues to increase. So it does go in the other direction, and there is evidence of the enrichment, enhancement of brain function by these kind of positive interventions.
So there's good stress and bad stress.
There's good stress and bad stress, that's for sure.
And maybe I can turn to Richard and ask 2 questions that I think are probably going to be on the minds of many others in the audience as well. One was you described some highly effective programs, the KIP program and and others. Could you describe, and you talked about some of the enrichment, could you tell us a little bit more, and whether these are scalable, whether these are programs that could be applied broadly, or is it something that's only going to happen in very unique environments?
Well, in theory, all of the interventions that I talked about could be done on a very large scale. Doesn't mean they could in practice, but they certainly could in theory. The effective pre-kindergarten programs differ from Head Start. A lot of Head Start situations, by the way, are little more than glorified babysitting, sometimes not even glorified. The effective programs really try to do something with the kids intellectually. They read to them, they teach them things about the world, they teach them classification, they teach them analogy, and so on. It's fun for the kids, but there's this extensive emphasis on intellectual skills pays off. And for the elementary school interventions, you couldn't duplicate KIP, Knowledge is Power program, on a wide scale the way it's done, because it's done with a single teacher who shows up at 7 a.m. and goes home at 6 p.m. and is there on Saturdays and is there well into the summer. These people are very dedicated, they're young, you can't do this beyond a certain point. So what you would have to do mentally is break that up. I mean, you'd have to have more teachers. You couldn't simply make a single individual be responsible for a class for that many hours a day. And we don't know what it would look like if you broke up the teaching into 2 or 3 people.
Just what do you think about the involvement of the parents? Because if a kid goes to an enrichment program and then goes home to a chaotic home environment where the parents are not supporting this, it's probably not going to work as well. Whereas if you bring the parents on board, and I wonder, I've heard that programs that have combined that sort of thing, bringing the family on board, perhaps tend to work better.
Right. I've heard this too. They're just starting to look at these recently. There are now programs before the kid is born. I mean, the teenage mother is, well, in teaching the mother how to be a mother, and the kinds of things that will matter in utero. But these kinds of things are important from the word go after birth, and we have visiting programs where nurses will come in and explain how to do certain things to the mother, emphasize to the mother how important intellectual stimulation is, and so on. There's a huge problem with a teenage mother of whatever race. They tend not to be very interested in their kid. I mean, they thought it would be fun to do, and it turns out not to be that much fun, and so grandma ends up being the one who takes care of the kid. But these programs are claiming that they have, and I believe the claims that they have changed the behavior of the mother. I don't know of any studies that look at outcomes.
Can I also ask you, what you've described is so different from the bell curve, and you told us a little bit, and it was interesting to see how you can look at the same data and realize that the studies weren't performed the right way, that the wrong conclusions were drawn, and they were inadequately controlled, essentially. But you also described the fact that one of the authors of the bell curve actually had data that went against the theory. Can you tell us a little bit more about why this individual either ignored this or walked away from it? Why it took 35 years to try to replicate these findings and to see the effect of the non-genetic and environmental component to IQ?
Well, specifically with regard to the bell curve and with regard to Herrnstein, I just don't know. It's a mystery to me. He's no longer alive, so he can't be asked. But there are, it's a very interesting scientific issue here. How is it, I mean, you can read the bell curve and you can listen to what I just said, and one of us is tremendously wrong, and naturally I think it's the standard IQ field. But the IQ field is the classical silo. I mean, nothing gets in, nothing gets out. You don't find many cognitive psychologists who are doing it. You'll find any social psychologists who are doing it. Very few developmental psychologists. The field of intelligence is occupied by intelligence researchers. So there were very little contact was made to the outside, and the edifice is very convincing. I mean, I believed it for decades. It is convincing on the surface, and there's evidence in support of it. I think the only explanation I have of why that it takes so long and by the way, the work, this isn't just my work, I'm reporting on work that's been done by Jim Flynn, by a brilliant economist named Bill Dickens, by Clancy Blair at NYU. This stuff it's relatively recent, but the basic story should have been doubted much earlier than it was, and I think it's because of this silo business.
Just one last question before we open it up to the audience. Is there anything useful to be said about what you've told us about intelligence and creativity?
Actually, there's very little known about that. The only thing I can say in the way of a scientific finding is quite interesting. If I'd had a little more time in my talk, I would have said, not only is fluid intelligence utterly different from crystallized intelligence, but we know there's documentation of two other important aspects of intelligence, which are in turn only somewhat, not very, correlated with analytic intelligence of the kind that IQ tests measure. One is practical intelligence, where you just give people a problem. Say, suppose you've got 3 roommates in their bedrooms of different sizes, and kids have different incomes, and they use the apartment for different reasons. What would be a reasonable amount for each kid to pay? Or you give a business person, you say, list of activities. Which of these activities would be most useful for an assistant professor to follow if he wanted to get tenure? The more the better people can answer such questions, the more effective they are in their own occupations, even if it's questions about outside their own occupation, if it's something that they've never experienced. So, the way I put this is in terms of my graduate students, I get graduate students with 1,400, 1,500 GREs who are certifiably brilliant, but they can't make it work. And the other thing that we do know something about is creativity, which, like practical intelligence, is not particularly correlated with analytic intelligence, which, like practical intelligence, makes an independent contribution to academic success and to occupational success. So the work there, it's sketchy, there's not that much done, but I'm persuaded that they have been pulled out of the intelligence basket and identified.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll open the floor to questions. We have some roving microphones. I would ask that you wait for them, and maybe we can start over on the far left, and we'll make our way across the room.
Hi, thank you. That was excellent. Can you clarify on one line that I didn't quite understand? You'd said the schooling contributed to the IQ. 1 year of school equals 2 years of age. And then I know you'd started to clarify that, and I missed the explanation in that. But one of the things that you hear is often for boys, when they're a summer baby or whatever deadline you're dealing with in terms of school, you should maybe hold them back if you have the option. But it sounds like that's not the case based on what you're saying. If you could just clarify what you were talking about.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. Could you repeat?
Can you just clarify the line you talked about, school contributing to IQ, 1 year of school equals 2 years of age? And that might answer my other question.
Well, just the simplest way to say that, a better way to say that, a kid who gets that first year of school, at the end of the year of school, he's two middle age years ahead of I botched it again. He's 2 years ahead of that kid. Oh God, he's 2 years ahead of where he was, and he's 1 year ahead of the kid who didn't have school, so 1 year of school equals 1 year of education. So, 1 year of age.
And I think the second part of the question was whether the idea of holding back, which people often advocate, whether that's misguided.
Well, eventually kids do catch up to some degree, although I don't think that research has been done to know exactly how much they catch up. Those of you who've read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, know that if you have a birthday in January, you can be a great hockey player. If you have a birthday in July, forget it. So that early identification of talent and promotion of it and so on, that comes from the kid who's started school at a time when he's bigger and stronger and faster than other kids. That gain persists forever. So I don't know how much gap closing there is for kids who start late. It may be complete. I mean, it may even be overshoot for all I know. There may actually be advantages of holding off, but in the short term, not.
Maybe in the middle row there, and then we'll continue to make our way across the. Great.
Thank you. I have a question about the fluid intelligence. You said that's the working memory. If children with attention deficit disorder have if I'm correct about this, their working memory is compromised, it doesn't work as well. Does that then compromise their intelligence?
I don't know about these, and I think actually Bruce may be able to answer this kind of question better than I can. But I don't know of a connection between ADD and working memory one way or the other. But maybe you do.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that one.
Yeah, I'd like to, I guess, I took away, correctly or incorrectly, that your view of intelligence is somewhat static, that if you are of a certain IQ in the first or second grade, that you're sort of stuck with that IQ for the rest of your life. Is that, you're not saying that, are you?
No, I mean, quite the contrary.
So if it's not static and people can catch up a lot, why are you so concerned about what happens in the kindergarten or first grade or second grade? I mean, are you saying that they really can't catch up in 7th grade, 10th grade, later on in life, that they're not imprisoned by having a low IQ?
I mean, it's an extremely important question. I can say some things about it. I mean, if you've got impaired fluid IQ functioning on a daily basis in elementary school, you're just losing opportunity to build a base. I mean, some of that stuff is going to be very hard to recoup. We don't know to what degree it can be recouped, but and then I was talking with Bruce earlier about stress effects over the long term and reversibility of PFC functioning and therefore presumably reversibility of fluid intelligence capacity.
Yeah. And I might add, I mean, sort of related to the other question I said I didn't have any specific information on, but in general, the prefrontal cortex is a very important organ that develops a bit more slowly later than other brain regions and allows the person to delay gratification, to do proactive planning, or on the other hand, to not do that and be more impulsive, to be less able to control emotions, to be less able to control many aspects of their behavior, as well as the working memory. And having those tools enables them to be educated to plan for the future, and not having those tools has an impairing effect. But one thing you have to remember is the prefrontal cortex develops more slowly in boys than in girls. Why are there high auto insurance rates for males? It's because their PFC is not develops at different rates in different individuals. The good news is that there is plasticity in the brain. The plasticity tends to decline as we get older. It may be enhanced by physical activity and by other things, but there is reversible plasticity, and the plasticity is very important because even when something bad has happened, there are the possibilities, even though it requires more time and effort and money, to reverse these things. And I think in neuroscience we're just beginning to realize there is untapped potential of brain plasticity. And I think we just still have to learn how to make good use of it.
Good evening. Thank you very much for all your discussions and for all your information. I have one question which may open the whole conversation, take the conversation in another direction. There was one sentence on the screen having to do with computerization. And just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, the Wall Street Journal ran a very big article on the game, the studies that have been done with intellectual development and eye-hand contact with the game, with all the games that are out there. And now there's a new game called Drop 7, which is like the Ne Plus Ultra that has just been released. So I would like your comments as to whether this younger generation, I would say people that were brought up with computers and play games constantly, whether this will affect their IQs. I'm asking you to make suppositions, because I don't think there's been enough time or study to study this computerization project.
Yeah, it's tremendously important, and there's many aspects of your question. The one that I can answer is that there are some computer programs that do improve working memory. And the favorite IQ test of some people is something called a matrices test, where you're shown shapes that are altering in various ways, one row of shapes altering in a particular way and another row of shapes, and you're supposed to figure out what the alteration rule is. And that requires a lot of working memory. You've got to hold all of these objects in mind and think of the ways in which they're being transformed and try and form a rule there and so on. So it's really sort of the quintessential test of fluid intelligence. You can increase that by a half standard deviation with not that many hours of the right kinds of computer training, including some that are computer games. Many computer games don't do anything, that's clear, but there are some, I mean, it's not clear, how would I know? I mean, there are many that do nothing for fluid intelligence because they've been pitted against one another. But there certainly are.
These games may act in the long run, not necessarily in my lifetime, but perhaps in the lifetime of the university, to reduce the gap between the economic levels.
In theory, I mean, yes, there are computer programs that are used that could in theory compensate to a degree for teaching inadequacy. I mean, there's one particular company that produces a program intended to teach kids how to read, and it has no impact. That same company has a program teaching kids how to write, and that improves very significantly their reading. So.
Great. But if you take the most popular video games that our children play, are they good, bad, or indifferent?
That's way beyond my expertise.
Okay, great. Okay, in the middle here. Great.
Hi, thank you very much for your discussion tonight. I have a very non-scientific question that would really just be about making suppositions. I'm curious, living in the city as a mother, going in an upper middle class neighborhood, what the big difference is between going to a very good public school versus paying $40,000 for a private school. I do see benefits to both. On the one hand, public school, I think you learn to navigate very well and make your way through, but the class sizes, as you mentioned, the importance about class size is much greater, about 30 kids per class, whereas in the private schools, there are about 16 to 20 kids per class. And on the other hand, in the private school, you have a bunch of very wealthy children who really don't necessarily offer diversity or learning a lot, struggling and things like that, where there's a benefit to that you get in public school. So I'm just wondering about that impact on child's
I mean the private versus public dimension, or the?
Yeah, in an upper middle class area.
I can't really answer that question. The specific question about school size, though, I think we do have an answer. This is not specifically with upper middle class kids. It's with a whole range of kids. Beautiful study done in Tennessee a decade or so ago, where class of kids, you flipped a coin. Kids either goes into a class with an average of 17 other kids in it, or a class with 27 other kids in it. And at the end of a year, the kid in the smaller classroom is a third of a standard deviation ahead on academic subjects. That's really no joke. But, and it's actually, the impact is bigger for minority kids than it is for majority kids. But that's expensive, and the society has to decide what the cost benefit is.
Take a question in the middle there, maybe that mic up there, yep.
You mentioned in passing instructional effectiveness, which I guess might be a proxy for all the parents here trying to figure out whether their kids' teachers are good teachers or not. And I wondered what guidance you could give us for assessing instructional effectiveness, and maybe the Teachers Union in New York would benefit from some guidance as well.
That's a question about educational practice. I just can't answer. The judgment was made by having people come and watch what's going on in the classroom, and they evaluate the teacher, and the teachers who get the top third versus the bottom third is decided by their peers who judge their performance in class.
Well, I think we have time probably for one more question, and there were quite a few hands here. This lady here.
Thank you. It seems to me that one of the ways we get stuck with reconceiving of intelligence the way you're talking about it is because we think of it as this one unified thing, and we have a word for it, and that we really don't understand the different kinds of fluid crystallized that you're talking about. So, and I'm an educator, so I think about this all the time. And it filters down to a notion of IQ, of standardized testing, of our whole testing industrial complex. So I'm wondering, from the science, what do you think are the most salient categories in which we should think about intelligence, and what are the ways that sort of popular opinion could hold on to them clearly, that we have different mental buckets that would help move this agenda forward?
Well, that's pretty much the center of what I'm thinking about these days, but I don't have much to say as a scientist about it. I mean, I take as an example, lately I've been thinking about the following case and what do we learn from it. I get 19-year-old kids every now and then in a class, and I start talking to the kid, and within a few sentences, it's clear I'm dealing with a peer. I mean, the kid has got, he's got, or she has got the general idea of what's going on, is able to ask the right questions, is able to make interesting observations. I mean, that kid is not going to have a spectacularly high IQ necessarily, but it's just, is the kid doing that in philosophy class? Is he doing that in biology class? I don't know, but I do know that it's certainly penetrating example of intelligence, and I don't think it's fully caught by IQ tests, and I don't know how to, I wouldn't have any idea how to devise an IQ test to study that.
Well, there'll be a reception where we can continue the conversation, but before we go there are two things. First, I'd like to thank Richard and Bruce for an excellent discussion.